I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's August 27th, and we have a lot to talk about. Every so often, I get questions from some of you about me. And not too long ago, I was approached by Kyra Millich, a listener who I interviewed back on episode number 103 of RealTalk MS. Kyra said she thought that the RealTalk MS listener community would be interested in getting to know me better, and she asked if I was open to having her interview me. I don't often get the opportunity to be the one being interviewed, so I was willing to go along with Kyra's suggestion. And here we are. In today's episode, you'll learn some things about me. You'll find out what I like to do when I'm not doing this podcast. You'll hear about some memorable moments in my life. You'll hear how and why I started RealTalk MS. And hopefully, you'll get to know me a little better. But before we get to Kyra's conversation with me, there are a few other things that you should know about. Living with MS means learning to live with uncertainty. So far, it isn't possible to accurately predict what any individual's MS disease course is likely to be, but based on newly published research from the University of Washington, it appears highly unlikely that someone with MS will also be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. This research collaboration between Washington University School of Medicine's MS experts and their Alzheimer's experts revealed that while cognitive impairment is very much a symptom of MS, people living with MS are far less likely to develop Alzheimer's disease compared to people who don't have MS. The researchers used a new FDA-approved blood test that was actually developed by Washington University School of Medicine. This blood test is highly effective at predicting the presence of amyloid plaques in the brain. These plaques are an indicator of Alzheimer's disease, and prior to the development of this simple blood test, the only way to verify them was through MRI scans or spinal taps, which may sound pretty familiar to anyone who's been diagnosed with MS. The Washington University researchers recruited 100 people with MS and 300 people who didn't have MS to take this blood test. And they found that 50% fewer MS patients had amyloid plaques compared to the quote-unquote healthy group who didn't have MS. The researchers also discovered that the more typical someone's MS history was in terms of age of onset, severity, and overall disease progression, the less likely they were to have amyloid plaques compared to those people with MS who had atypical presentations of the disease. The next step following this discovery is to identify what it is in the genetics of someone with MS or the biology of multiple sclerosis itself that's protective against Alzheimer's disease, all of which could lead to new Alzheimer's treatments. We'll keep you updated as this work continues, and if you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. TG Therapeutics has announced that they will begin a phase 1 clinical trial of a CAR T cell therapy called azercaptogene zaprulacel, or Azer-cel. CAR T-cell therapy is proven to be effective in treating certain cancers, and this therapy has been in the news lately as several biotech companies are in clinical trials to test the safety and efficacy of their particular CAR T-cell therapy in treating MS. Most CAR T-cell therapies use a patient's own T-cells, which are extracted and modified by adding something called a chimeric antigen receptor, or CAR. These modified CAR T-cells are capable of recognizing specific molecules that are found on the surface of other cells. So these modified CAR T-cells are reintroduced into the patient by infusion, and once they recognize that specific molecule, the CAR T-cells kill the cell that the molecule is attached to. In this case, Azer-cel contains CAR T-cells that are modified to recognize a molecule on the surface of B cells called CD19. Once these CAR T cells are infused into the patient, they identify that CD19 molecule and eliminate those B cells. Some disease-modifying therapies like Ocrevus or Kesimpta also target B cells. These DMTs happen to target a different protein on the surface of B cells called CD20. Now, a moment ago, I told you that most CAR T cell therapies use a patient's own T cells. However, GT Therapeutics Azer-cel does not. Instead, T cells are collected from other donors, providing a more consistent supply of this off-the-shelf therapy, making Azer-cel more accessible. We'll keep you posted as this phase 1 clinical trial gets underway and additional information becomes available. Completing this week's reporting on the latest CAR T-cell therapies to announce clinical trials, the FDA has given approval to biotech company Impact Bio to begin a phase 1 clinical trial for IMPT-514, an experimental CAR T-cell therapy for people with hard-to-treat MS. A moment ago, when we were talking about another CAR T-cell therapy, I told you that it targeted a specific molecule. Well, IMPT-514 is what's called a bispecific CAR T-cell therapy, which means it targets two different molecules, in this case, CD19 and CD20, two proteins that are most often found on the surface of B cells. That CD20 protein is also found on the surface of a subset of T cells that produce large amounts of pro-inflammatory molecules. So by targeting both of these proteins, IMPT-514 is positioned to kill both B cells and those disease-causing T cells with the CD20 protein on their surface. The hoped-for outcome is that this single dose of IMPT-514 will, in effect, reset an individual's immune system by depleting all of the bad-acting immune cells in an individual. I should also point out that CAR T cells are capable of crossing the blood-brain barrier, so unlike disease-modifying therapies that target B cells but can't cross the blood-brain barrier, this therapy holds a promise of killing all of those infected B cells and inflammation-producing T cells in circulation and in the central nervous system. This phase 1 clinical trial will analyze the safety and efficacy of a single dose of IMPT-514 in people with all forms of MS who have suboptimal or poor disease management despite having received high-efficacy disease-modifying therapies. This clinical trial is slated to begin in mid-2025, and we'll be sure to keep you posted as it gets underway. If you're a regular listener, you already know that I rely on the RealTalk MS listener community to let me know which topics you'd like to hear about on this podcast. A few years ago, in episode number 264, listener Dawnia Baynes did a podcast takeover and interviewed me. Since then, I've heard from a bunch of you who, for some reason, want to hear more from me. So when listener Kyra Millich asked if she could interview me, it felt like it was time. In a moment, you'll hear Kyra's conversation with me.
Good morning, John. Thank you so much for your time today and allowing us to flip the script and let yourself be interviewed.
Happy to do it, Kyra.
Well, John, just so your listeners know, I work with the National MS Society and have had the pleasure of working with you for many years on various topics. And I have forever, since I've known you, been in awe of your wisdom and your down-to-earth ability to convey even the most complicated of research terms and medical technology to people that aren't doctors or researchers, as well as your passion. So I appreciate you saying yes when I said, why don't we interview you, John? You share so much, and what about you? So thanks for that.
I am happy to do that. I don't know that there's all that much interesting to learn, but here we are. So fire away.
All right. Okay. Well, John, I'd like to know a little bit about who you are. Where were you born? What are some of your passions, peak experiences in life, and maybe something that really altered your life?
Sure. Well, I was born in the East Coast, technically New Jersey. We moved to New York when I was still very, very young. And from there, moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where I lived until I finished college, at which point I moved to Los Angeles, and I am still here. I think I've been here long enough in California to qualify as a native even. So that's where I am from. Some of my passions. Well, I think one of them a lot of people know about. I know you know about it. It's magic. I've been interested in magic since I was about 4 years old, and that interest has not waned. Perhaps a little more passionate lately than I was back then even. So magic is a passion. I love to play in the kitchen. I like to cook. I'm a self-described foodie, and I'm into wine. I love listening to jazz and classic rock. So I guess that's me. An event that may have altered my life. Well, I would have to say, when I was almost 4 years old, my parents took me to a TV show that was done live every day. It was a local show in New York, New Jersey area, and it was on at noon. It was called The Magic Clown. I think you might see where this is going. It was called The Magic Clown, and that show was hosted by a clown who did magic and showed cartoons. And in between some of the cartoons, he would do some tricks. And it was done before a live kiddie audience. And the children would all sit at these small little bistro tables that were our size and actually be served lunch. And I guess the thinking was, since this was on at noon, is that kids at home would see us eating lunch and they'd be eating lunch and we'd all be watching the cartoons and the magic together. Anyway, I got taken to be in the audience, and he asked for a volunteer to help with a trick, and I got selected, and I was given a magic wand, and he showed me an empty top hat, and he told me to wave the wand over the hat, and I did, and when I looked again, it was full of popcorn. And
oh my goodness.
I thought that was a great trick. I still think that's a great trick. And and he asked me, he said, "What do you want to do with the popcorn?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to share it with the other kids here." And after the show, he took my mom aside and me and said he was impressed with my choice to share the popcorn, and he wanted to reward that. So he loaded me up with so many gifts and toys, and it was literally more than I could carry. And I remember thinking about that as we went home. And when we got back home, I just looked at this huge pile of, and maybe it wasn't so huge, but I was much shorter at the time, so it seemed huge to me. And I looked at this huge pile of toys and everything. And I guess this is the classic positive reinforcement response. I said, "Hey, I want a magic kit," because so far magic has been very good to me. And that's really what got me started on this lifelong interest in magic.
And you are an amazing magician, and you do share the fruits of your labors. I eat popcorn with all the kernels of wisdom you share through your podcast, RealTalk MS. So how many years has RealTalk MS been going, and how many episodes are you at?
So let's see. We are over 350 episodes. And if you actually count the special episodes that are done, those are just the weekly episodes. If you count the special episodes from conferences and what have you, we've actually done over 400 episodes. It's in its 7th year, which is, every time I say that, it is unbelievable even to me. And what I'm most gratified about is that people continue to respond to the podcast. And by that, I mean a couple of different things. First, I can say that since the day it launched, almost 7 years ago, it'll be 7 years in September, the audience has continued to grow. And that amazes me. And I'm very, very grateful that people who listen want to share it with other people who might be affected by MS. But their response is not just in listening. I've always tried to remind my listeners that I kind of look at the podcast as a conversation, a two-way conversation. And so their part in that conversation is to circle back with me, emails, DMs, sometimes in person when we're at conferences or different events, and tell me what they like, what they want to see more of, what their ideas are for different subjects that they'd like us to talk about on the podcast. So it tends to really reflect back what my audience is most interested in. And I'm very grateful that a day does not go by when I don't hear from people who are listening to the podcast and want to share some ideas or simply give me a critique. They're very good with that. I know exactly how my audience feels about virtually every episode. So that wish of mine to really make it more of a conversation and less of a monologue is something that I'm very, very happy about. And it doesn't always happen with podcasts. So I'm grateful it's happened with this one.
Well, you're very easy to talk to. And I'm not surprised that all of your listeners around the world have something to share. So thank you for being receptive. Why did you start RealTalk MS? You talk about it at the introduction of every podcast, of course, about Gene. But, in addition to personal reasons, why professionally did you feel that this was something that was longing to happen in the podcast world?
I was very fortunate to be selected as one of 3 non-scientist members of the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee. And when that happened, I started attending meetings with some of the best and brightest neurologists, researchers in the world. And when I heard about some of the remarkable research that they were involved in, that they were leading, I came away from those meetings feeling really encouraged about the future, thinking that, unfortunately, progressive MS was something that happened in my family, but perhaps in the future and the not too distant future, other families won't have to be affected the same way. And I also realized I was the only lay person from North America in the room during those meetings. And I thought, well, maybe if I shared some of this information, if I kind of translated it into more easy to understand English and shared it with people, maybe others would be as encouraged about the future as I was. And so I started thinking about how I wanted to do that. And as I thought about it, the first thing I thought about was, well, I can write a blog. But then I realized not everyone living with MS can easily navigate a blog. My wife couldn't. She would have difficulty actually seeing the monitor. She'd have difficulty maneuvering the mouse. So I sure wanted to do something that I knew she could listen to. And so then I thought, maybe a podcast. And this was actually right before podcasting before it exploded. So I listened, I had listened to a couple of podcasts, but I had no idea how to do one. I'll also say it wasn't quite as simple as it is today, which is great for people who are getting into it now. So I gave myself 90 days to learn how to produce a podcast, and then I launched. And in those 90 days, I also realized there was no reason to limit what I was going to talk about to progressive MS. The more I looked around, the more I realized there was tremendous research being done that was going to resolve issues for people living with relapsing remitting MS. And so I thought, I should probably broaden my sights a little bit here, broaden the topics I want to cover. And that's sort of how the podcast started. And the other thing that I wanted to do was not only talk about research related subjects. I'm a big believer in advocacy. I think advocating on your own behalf is incredibly empowering. And I think advocating on behalf of the MS community delivers results, real results that we can point to. And so I thought, I can use the podcast as a platform to tell people, educate them about how easy advocacy is and why they might want to get involved, and show them or make sure they were aware of when there were opportunities to advocate on behalf of a particular piece of legislation or whatever. So thinking about advocacy and research and treatment, I guess I was ready to start.
Absolutely. And we're also lucky. How big is your listenership, by the way?
Every week, depending on the topic, we reach somewhere between 15 to 18,000 listeners in over 100 different countries.
Wow, that's amazing, John. I'd love to know some of the most inspiring moments or information that you've gleaned from this huge tapestry that you are weaving.
Honestly, I learn something new every single week. And so we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of episodes, years of having those moments where I say to myself, wow, this could make a difference. Last week, I learned that Google's AI company, which is called DeepMind, just released a new version of an AI model that is specific to drug development.
Wow.
Yes. And how using that is going to save researchers so much time and money, because the thing about drug development that's tricky is, without getting drilling down too far here, is finding proteins and molecules that can successfully or effectively bind together. So if you have, and that's how medication works. That's a long and difficult and expensive process to figure out where the best place on that molecule is to bind a protein. And sometimes they don't work at all. Well, now a researcher can find that out with a few clicks of a mouse before they invest more time and more energy, perhaps going in a direction that isn't going to yield them the results they're looking for. I think that's transformational science. I think
absolutely.
It's going to allow for more and faster work to be done in drug development, not just for MS, but for basically everything. This AI model has successfully modeled every living molecule, including the complete human DNA. So it's incredibly valuable. And again, it's a real change agent in terms of how science is going to be done. So I think one of the things that, when we look back, will be perhaps one of the most profound changes in research, in science, is how AI is going to make things faster and cheaper and easier. We get to the results way sooner. So I'm excited about that.
I'm excited too, John. And you talk about research, and obviously the data needs to be good, and the recipients of the trials need to have positive experiences. And working for the National MS Society, I know that we are the largest private funder of research in the world. And I know you've been involved with the society a couple times, a couple iterations. Once was a while ago. And then you came back to the society after, working with the International Progressive MS Alliance, or volunteering, I should say. So what brought you back to the National MS Society? And when you talk about research, the society funds more than just one doctor. They really vet who they're going to fund to get the best and the brightest to the top. So if you could kind of look at that in response to why you're back with the society now and what you see moving forward.
Well,
that'd be great.
The MS Society literally the day my wife was diagnosed with MS, that same day, we turned to the National MS Society initially to learn about multiple sclerosis. And I got involved. And unfortunately then, and we're talking about the late 1990s, there just wasn't a whole lot going on for people with progressive MS. And that became frustrating. So I probably sat on the sideline for a while until the National MS Society launched, and they were the driving force behind launching the International Progressive MS Alliance. And what they did was recognizing that there was not enough work being done in progressive MS, is they mobilized MS societies around the world into a collaborative, specialized group, this alliance, that was focused only on progressive MS. And that became a game changer. And obviously, it did more than get my attention. It got my involvement in a huge way. As soon as I heard about it, the first thing I did was when I was told that they were looking for some lay people to be on the scientific steering committee, was I went ahead and put my application in, crossed my fingers. And it's funny, I don't think I was the only one who was thinking like that in the world, because they got almost 300 applications from over 20 different countries, people who heard about it and realized, wow, this is going to be a difference maker, and I'd like to contribute and be a part of it. So they were inundated. And because of that, it was a 9-month process for them to go through those applications and finally make their final decisions. I was very, very fortunate to be one of the 3 that was selected. And our role was to make sure that the voices of people who are affected by progressive MS were involved in all of the work that the Alliance was going to be involved in. And it could not have been a better, more special experience for me. I would say right up there with being on the Magic Clown when I was 4 years old, I would say being named to the Scientific Steering Committee for the Alliance was life-changing for me.
Yeah, for all of us. And how many years was that term?
So I termed out after 6 years, which was the maximum we could serve. The three of us came in and came out together, and actually I was involved in helping to recruit and vet the next group of folks who came in who represented people affected by MS. But the 3 of us became very close. We named ourselves the 3 MS-keteers. And I would say, to the credit of everyone on the Scientific Steering Committee, all of the scientists who were sat around the table, and there were, 23, 25 of them, they listened carefully. Every time we weighed in and talked about why a particular research project would be most beneficial to people who were affected by progressive MS, or why one might be too burdensome for someone with progressive MS to actually participate in a clinical trial. So they listened carefully, and I think we made a difference.
I agree, John. Thank you. So I'd like to kind of pivot to, you have 7 years of experience, and 2017, I believe, was the first primary progressive drug that came out. Ocrevus. Okay. So a lot has happened since 2017, and I'd like to know your advice, given all the information that you've gleaned in these past 7 years with RealTalk MS. I'd like to know what you would say to somebody newly diagnosed, somebody living with progressive MS, and to family members for both of those people.
The first
or
thing,
groups, I should say.
The first thing I'd say to all of them is I'm not a doctor, and I don't even play one on a podcast. But
thank God you're not a doctor, John, because most of us that listen to it are not doctors either, I dare say. So you make things understandable from the most cerebral of neurologists, I got to say.
Well, from my perspective, as someone who was my wife's caregiver for 23 years, and saw all the ways that MS really does impact a family, I think. What would I tell someone who's newly diagnosed? Well, I know some people say things like, well, really, there couldn't be a better time because. I wouldn't say that. because that person who just got diagnosed isn't thinking this is a great time. And so I wouldn't try to sell that, right? I think what I would say to them is this is a time where many people can live full, active lives living with MS because of some of the treatments that are available today. MS is more manageable than it's ever been. And that's a good thing. So I would tell them that first. I would tell them to, as we all do our own research, and I put that in air quotes there, as we all do our own research, to make sure they're getting their information from reliable sources. I would start with I would start with the National MS Society. I'd like to think that RealTalk MS belongs on that list because the only things we talk about are evidence-based kinds of science. I would, and I would tell them to take all of the frightening things they were about to read on social media with a huge grain of salt. I would remind them that if you look at 10 people with MS, sometimes it looks like you're seeing 10 people with 10 different diseases because MS impacts everyone differently. And so someone's experience that they're writing about on social media, well, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be your experience, and it probably means it won't be your experience. So I would say take that with a heavy grain of salt, because today you can go online, you can read things, and they're terrifying. Sometimes they're simply not true. Other times they are describing an unfortunate situation, but one person's unfortunate situation, especially when it comes to multiple sclerosis, doesn't necessarily translate to another person. And I think that's important to keep in mind. What I would tell their family, I think that was part of your question. What would I tell their family? I would tell them that my experience says that MS does not impact individuals. It impacts families. And I would ask them to consider that perspective going in. I would ask them to be supportive. I would want to know who is going to be accompanying that patient to their appointments with their neurologist, who is going to be the one who's going to remind someone to take medications for symptom management, who's going to be the one who makes some notes in between those neurologist visits, because they don't happen very often and a lot can transpire. I think people who are living with MS today will recognize this. When you go to meet with your treating physician, the first thing they're going to say is, so, how are things going? How have you been? Now, if you haven't seen that doctor for 6 months or even a year, which is quite the norm, it's hard to remember all the days, weeks, and months, right? And so what people tend to do, what I saw my wife do, and what I've heard from other people, it's kind of the same behavior. What they do is they base their answer on how they've been over the last week or two, what's easy to remember. So if they've been having a good few weeks prior to that appointment, they're going to say, oh, things have been going well. And if they haven't been having a great couple of weeks before that appointment, they're going to say, well, things are not going so well. And what's great about having a family member, having somebody else in the room with you, is they have a slightly different perspective. They might be the ones to say, well, yeah, the last few weeks have been great, but do you remember like 2 months ago, you couldn't get out of bed that day? And that helps that doctor get a real full picture of how their patient is doing. And I think that helps in terms of treatment plan.
Yeah. And I can say, as someone living with MS, that sometimes it's hard to acknowledge some of those things that have happened, and not to mention the depression. So that's really sage advice. And what about somebody, and I also wanted to shout out that MS Navigator provides free resources and information for somebody with MS. So I just invite your listeners to check out MS Navigator, including the caregivers. What advice would you give to people with progressive MS, with all that you've gleaned in your 7 years of experience, not to mention living with Jean and caregiving for her?
Well, I would say that there's never been a time in history where so much effort, so much in the way of financial resources, so much in the way of expertise has been focused on progressive MS. And so, once again, is it a great time to be diagnosed? No. There's never a good time to be diagnosed with a chronic illness for which there is no cure. But having said that, there is more going on now that's going to support people with progressive MS than ever before. I would tell them, in addition to the National MS Society, to make sure the International Progressive MS Alliance is on their radar and to refer to their website for lots of good information, lots of good research specific to progressive MS.
Absolutely. All right. And we just have 1 minute left. What do you think is an unknown that you wish could be heard, really heard by the entire MS world?
I don't think this is an unknown, but I think it is somewhat known, but not leveraged, not used often enough. And that is that we can make lifestyle choices every day that will improve quality of life for someone who's living with MS. I think a lot of times we sit back and wait for the next pharmaceutical to come along that's going to solve our symptoms or prevent progression or whatever it's designed to do. And that is going to happen. We'll continue to see new medications that make it easier and better to manage MS. But in between those moments of discovery and the times when those new medications hit the marketplace, I think there's a great opportunity to take advantage of exercise. And people living with MS, including progressive MS, there are exercises they can do that evidence shows not only makes them feel good, but improves their condition, improves their physical condition. So thinking about exercise, thinking about diet. Now, there is no quote unquote MS diet that's been identified and shown to be effective. But what has been shown to be effective is a healthy diet. There's a lot of evidence that says a Mediterranean diet makes sense. So it's not necessarily a diet that's incredibly restrictive, but one where you're taking care of your body by putting the right things into it. That makes a difference. Limiting your alcohol consumption, stopping smoking. These are things, agreeably, they're not all easy to do, but these are things that someone can step up and decide today they're going to adopt one of these behaviors. And maybe a couple of months down the road, they're going to adopt another one. And those things can have a real impact in how they are doing. I heard you mention a few minutes ago the word depression. That's something that affects more than half the people who are living with MS. And
absolutely.
And you can make lifestyle changes that are going to have a positive impact on depression. So again, it doesn't mean you have to take one more medication. You don't need one more pill or injection or infusion. You can just decide to do some things for yourself. And I think when you do those things for yourself and you then see the outcome, it's really empowering because you know who's responsible for that. You are. And I think that's a great feeling, especially when you're living with MS and you can sometimes feel like you don't have control over how you're going to feel tomorrow. You don't know how you're going to wake up and perhaps have to deal with a new symptom or a worsening symptom. And those things aren't under your control. But there are things that you can choose to do that can make a difference in your overall well-being.
Wow, John, those are all really sage pieces of advice and insights. And, from a disease that takes so much and is so unknown, you reliably share that popcorn of wisdom with us day after day with your podcast. Final question, John. What is the future of RealTalk MS? How much longer are you going to be doing this podcast?
Kyra, I am here until there's a cure. So I'm in it till the end.
Amen, John. Thank you so much. That will be soon, I hope.
You and me both. That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/365. You'll find that link in today's show notes so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll pay a visit to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.